Sarah never imagined that her camera would one day be replaced by a sniper rifle. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty Afghan village as she adjusted her press vest and checked her equipment one final time. After 5 years covering conflicts around the world, she had learned to read the signs of danger in every alley, every rooftop, every face that watched her pass. The assignment seemed routine enough. Her editor at Global News Network had sent her to document the daily lives of civilians caught between Taliban forces and coalition troops. The village sat precariously on the border, a place where children played soccer in fields that doubled as after dark. Sarah had spent 3 days earning the trust of local families, sharing tea with mothers who spoke of lost sons and fathers who worked the poppy fields because no other crops would grow in the war-torn soil. Her translator had become more than just a voice between languages. The young man possessed an uncanny ability to sense shifts in the village's mood. On Tuesday morning, he pulled Sarah aside as they prepared to interview the village elder. His weathered face carried worry lines that seemed deeper than usual. "Something is different today," whispered in heavily accented English. "The children are not in the streets. The shop owners close their doors too early. Even the dogs hide under the houses." Sarah had noticed it too. The usual bustle of morning activity felt muted, as if the entire village held its breath. She had covered enough conflicts to recognize the invisible tension that preceded violence. Her journalistic instincts screamed at her to investigate further, but her survival instincts urged caution. The satellite phone in her backpack buzzed with an incoming message from her producer in London. The network wanted footage of the new medical clinic that international aid workers had established on the village outskirts. It was supposed to be a positive story, a rare bright spot in the endless cycle of destruction and rebuilding that defined this corner of Afghanistan. Sarah made her decision. Professional obligation outweighed personal unease. She would visit the clinic, conduct interviews with the medical staff, and capture footage of children receiving vaccinations. The story would air during prime time, offering viewers a glimpse of hope amid the chaos. The walk to the clinic took them through the village's main thoroughfare, past mud brick houses with windows that seemed to watch their every step. Chatted nervously about his sister's upcoming wedding, his voice carrying an artificial cheerfulness that fooled neither of them. Sarah kept her camera ready, though she found herself paying more attention to potential escape routes than to photographic opportunities. The medical clinic stood at the intersection of 3 dirt roads, a simple concrete building painted white with a red cross that had faded to pink under the harsh desert sun. Doctor, a Spanish physician with Doctors Without Borders, greeted them at the entrance. Her smile was genuine but tired, the expression of someone who had seen too much suffering to be anything but grateful for positive press coverage. "We see about 60 patients a day," Doctor explained as she led them through the small facility. "Mostly children with malnutrition and preventable diseases. Last week, we delivered 3 bobbies. In a place where infant mortality is so high, every life saved feels like a victory." Sarah filmed the doctor's interview while translated for local patients who wanted to share their stories. An elderly man spoke about walking 15 kilometers to bring his grandson for treatment. A young mother cradled her baby who had survived pneumonia thanks to antibiotics that cost less than $5. The morning passed peacefully. Sarah captured footage of medical procedures, interviewed aid workers, and documented the small miracles that occurred daily in this unlikely sanctuary. For a few hours, the war felt distant, pushed back by the simple act of healing. Suggested they break for lunch at his cousin's house, which sat halfway between the clinic and the main village. The modest home offered a commanding view of the surrounding terrain, including the narrow valley where coalition forces occasionally patrolled. Sarah agreed, grateful for the opportunity to review her footage and plan the afternoon's interviews. They were sharing flatbread and strong tea when cousin burst through the door. The man spoke rapidly in Pashto, his words tumbling over each other in obvious panic. His face went pale as he listened, then turned to Sarah with fear in his eyes. "Taliban fighters have surrounded the clinic," he translated. "They have hostages. The coalition forces are coming, but they are still 1 hour away. My cousin says we should leave immediately, go to the mountains until the fighting stops." Sarah's mind raced. Her professional instincts warred with common sense. The story developing at the clinic would be international news. If Taliban forces had taken hostages at a medical facility, it represented a significant escalation in tactics. Her footage could provide crucial evidence of war crimes, but staying meant risking capture or death. Through the window, she could see smoke rising from the direction of the clinic. The sound of gunfire echoed across the valley, distant but growing closer. Gathered their equipment with shaking hands, clearly expecting her to choose retreat. Instead, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She had covered conflicts from Somalia to Syria, always maintaining the journalist's sacred distance from the story. But as she watched smoke billow from a building where she had just filmed children receiving life-saving medical care, something shifted inside her. "We're not leaving," she told firmly. "Those people in the clinic trusted us to tell their story. We can't abandon them now." Stared at her as if she had lost her mind. Perhaps she had. But Sarah had spent 5 years documenting other people's courage. Today, she would discover her own. The next few hours would test everything she thought she knew about herself, about war, and about the thin line between observer and participant that every war correspondent must navigate. As they prepared to move toward the sound of gunfire, Sarah had no idea that her camera would soon be useless, and that her survival would depend on skills she never knew she possessed. The story of how the sound of automatic gunfire grew louder as Sarah and crept toward the clinic through a maze of abandoned houses and empty market stalls. The village had transformed into a ghost town within minutes of the Taliban attack. Doors hung open where families had fled in panic, leaving behind cooking pots still warm and children's toys scattered in dusty courtyards. Sarah's hands trembled as she checked her camera equipment. 5 years of war reporting had taught her to distinguish between different types of gunfire. The steady rhythm she heard now came from AK-47s, the Taliban fighters' weapon of choice. But underneath that familiar sound, she detected something else: the shorter, more controlled bursts of M4 carbines. Coalition forces had arrived earlier than expected. Pressed himself against a crumbling wall and pointed toward the clinic. "There," he whispered, "on the roof." Sarah raised her camera and zoomed in. 2 Taliban fighters had positioned themselves behind the clinic's low parapet, their rifles trained on something below. Through her telephoto lens, she could see muzzle flashes from ground level where coalition troops had taken cover behind a disabled military vehicle. The tactical situation became clear as she studied the scene. The Taliban had chosen their position well. The clinic sat on slightly elevated ground with clear sight lines in all directions. Coalition forces were pinned down in a drainage ditch about 200 meters away, unable to advance without crossing open ground that would expose them to sniper fire. "How many hostages?" Sarah asked, who was speaking quietly into his cell phone with someone inside the village. "My cousin says maybe 10 people. The Spanish doctor, 3 nurses, some patients who could not run fast enough. They are in the main treatment room." Sarah zoomed her camera toward the clinic's windows. She could see movement behind the glass, but the distance made it impossible to determine if the shapes belonged to hostages or captors. What she could see clearly was the strategic nightmare facing the coalition forces. Any assault on the building risked killing the very people they were trying to save. The Taliban fighters knew this, which explained their choice of target. A medical clinic provided perfect tactical cover while delivering maximum propaganda value. If coalition forces attacked and hostages died, the incident would dominate international headlines for weeks. The stalemate stretched on for 30 minutes. Sarah documented everything through her camera, capturing footage of the tactical situation while provided whispered translation of radio chatter he picked up on his phone. The coalition commander was requesting helicopter support, but the nearest gunships were committed to another operation 50 kilometers away. Then everything changed. A new sound joined the firefight, the deep rumble of approaching vehicles. Sarah swung her camera toward the road and saw dust clouds marking the advance of what looked like a Taliban reinforcement convoy. 3 pickup trucks loaded with armed fighters were racing toward the clinic from the north. "We need to warn the soldiers," said urgently. Sarah was already moving. She had spotted something the coalition forces couldn't see from their position in the drainage ditch. The approaching convoy would arrive at the clinic from the blind side of their defensive position. In 5 minutes, the Taliban would have enough fighters to overrun the coalition troops and execute every hostage in the building. They ran through empty houses, jumping over walls and sprinting across open courtyards. Sarah's press vest felt heavier with each step, her camera equipment banging against her ribs. Behind them, the sound of gunfire intensified as the convoy drew closer. The coalition forces had taken cover behind an overturned military transport truck about the size of a city bus. Sarah could see 4 soldiers, their desert camouflage making them nearly invisible against the sandy ground. Their radio antenna suggested they had communication with headquarters, but they clearly didn't know about the approaching reinforcements. Getting their attention meant crossing 40 meters of open ground while Taliban snipers watched from the clinic roof. Sarah made the decision without consulting. She stripped off her press vest, grabbed a white medical bandage from her first aid kit, and tied it to her camera tripod like a makeshift flag. "Wait here," she told. "If something happens to me, get back to the village and find another way to warn them." The run across open ground felt like it lasted hours. Every step expected the crack of a rifle shot. Every breath might be her last. The Taliban fighters on the roof had clear shots at her, but something stayed their trigger fingers. Perhaps they recognized her press credentials. Perhaps they wanted to use her as another hostage. Or perhaps they simply enjoyed watching someone make such an obviously futile gesture. She slid into the drainage ditch beside the coalition soldiers like a runner stealing second base, her landing cushioned by mud and standing water. 4 pairs of eyes stared at her in amazement. "Who the hell are you?" demanded the sergeant, a lean man with a Texas accent whose name tape read. "Sarah, Global News Network," she gasped. 3 trucks full of fighters coming from the North Road, maybe 20 men, they'll be here in 3 minutes. Sergeant grabbed his radio immediately. "Base, this is Bravo 27. We have incoming enemy reinforcements from the north. Request immediate close air support." The radio crackled with static before the response came through. "Bravo 27, negative on air support. All assets committed. You're on your own for another 30 minutes. Sarah watched the soldiers exchange glances. 30 minutes might as well have been 30 hours. The approaching convoy would overwhelm their position long before help arrived. Worse, once the Taliban controlled both the clinic and the surrounding area, they could execute the hostages at leisure while coalition forces watched helplessly from a distance. Studied the tactical situation through his binoculars. "We can't advance without getting those snipers off the roof, and we can't flank them with a convoy coming up behind us." "What about the hostages?" asked one of the younger soldiers. "If we don't do something, they're dead anyway," replied grimly. Sarah found herself studying the clinic through her camera's telephoto lens again. Something about the building's layout nagged at her memory. She had spent 2 hours inside that morning, filming interviews and documenting medical procedures. The structure was simpler than it appeared from the outside. "The building only has 1 staircase," she said suddenly. "Internal stairs, concrete, leading from the main treatment room to the roof. If someone could get inside and control those stairs, the snipers would be trapped up there." Lowered his binoculars. Getting inside means crossing 200 meters of open ground under sniper fire. It's suicide. "Not from the front," Sarah said, her mind racing through the building's layout. "There's a service entrance on the west side. It opens directly into the supply room, which connects to the main treatment area. I filmed there this morning. The angle from the roof position makes it impossible for the snipers to cover that entrance." "You're talking about a building assault with 4 men and no backup," said, "against an unknown number of enemies holding hostages." Sarah looked at her camera, then at the approaching dust clouds of the Taliban convoy. In her 5 years of war reporting, she had interviewed dozens of soldiers about split-second decisions made under impossible circumstances. Now she understood what they meant when they talked about moments when all the options were bad, but doing nothing was worst of all. "I know the building layout better than anyone here," she said, "and you need someone who can identify the hostages from the fighters." Stared at her. "Ma'am, with respect, you're a journalist. This is combat." "Those people in there trusted me to tell their story," Sarah replied. "I can't do that if they're all dead." The sergeant looked at his men, then at the approaching convoy, then back at Sarah. Combat decisions were made in seconds, based on incomplete information and instinct honed by training. But this decision would haunt him regardless of the outcome. "Can you handle a rifle?" he asked. Sarah thought about the weekends she had spent at her father's farm in Montana, learning to shoot deer and elk in the mountains above Missoula. That felt like another lifetime, but muscle memory was muscle memory. "Yes," she said simply. Handed her his sidearm, a 9 Beretta. Stay behind us. Don't shoot unless you're absolutely certain of your target. If we don't make it out, you run back the way you came and tell someone what happened here." As they prepared to move toward the clinic, Sarah realized she had crossed an invisible line that separated observer from participant. Her camera hung around her neck, but her hands gripped a pistol. In 10 minutes, she would discover that sometimes the most important stories could only be told by those willing to fight for the right to tell them. The convoy was getting closer. The hostages were running out of time, and Sarah was about to learn that war correspondents sometimes became warriors, whether they planned to or not. A war reporter became a deadly marksman was about to begin, written in the dust and blood of an Afghan village where the rules of engagement meant nothing, and where 11 perfect shots would save lives that no one else could. Sarah never imagined that her camera would one day be replaced by a sniper rifle. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty Afghan village as she adjusted her press vest and checked her equipment one final time. After 5 years covering conflicts around the world, she had learned to read the signs of danger in every alley, every rooftop, every face that watched her pass. The assignment seemed routine enough. Her editor at Global News Network had sent her to document the daily lives of civilians caught between Taliban forces and coalition troops. The village sat precariously on the border, a place where children played soccer in fields that doubled as after dark. Sarah had spent 3 days earning the trust of local families, sharing tea with mothers who spoke of lost sons and fathers who worked the poppy fields because no other crops would grow in the war-torn soil. Her translator had become more than just a voice between languages. The young man possessed an uncanny ability to sense shifts in the village's mood. On Tuesday morning, he pulled Sarah aside as they prepared to interview the village elder. His weathered face carried worry lines that seemed deeper than usual. "Something is different today," whispered in heavily accented English. "The children are not in the streets. The shop owners close their doors too early. Even the dogs hide under the houses." Sarah had noticed it too. The usual bustle of morning activity felt muted, as if the entire village held its breath. She had covered enough conflicts to recognize the invisible tension that preceded violence. Her journalistic instincts screamed at her to investigate further, but her survival instincts urged caution. The satellite phone in her backpack buzzed with an incoming message from her producer in London. The network wanted footage of the new medical clinic that international aid workers had established on the village outskirts. It was supposed to be a positive story, a rare bright spot in the endless cycle of destruction and rebuilding that defined this corner of Afghanistan. Sarah made her decision. Professional obligation outweighed personal unease. She would visit the clinic, conduct interviews with the medical staff, and capture footage of children receiving vaccinations. The story would air during prime time, offering viewers a glimpse of hope amid the chaos. The walk to the clinic took them through the village's main thoroughfare, past mud brick houses with windows that seemed to watch their every step. Chatted nervously about his sister's upcoming wedding, his voice carrying an artificial cheerfulness that fooled neither of them. Sarah kept her camera ready, though she found herself paying more attention to potential escape routes than to photographic opportunities. The medical clinic stood at the intersection of 3 dirt roads, a simple concrete building painted white with a red cross that had faded to pink under the harsh desert sun. Doctor, a Spanish physician with Doctors Without Borders, greeted them at the entrance. Her smile was genuine but tired, the expression of someone who had seen too much suffering to be anything but grateful for positive press coverage. "We see about 60 patients a day," Doctor explained as she led them through the small facility. "Mostly children with malnutrition and preventable diseases. Last week, we delivered 3 bobbies. In a place where infant mortality is so high, every life saved feels like a victory." Sarah filmed the doctor's interview while translated for local patients who wanted to share their stories. An elderly man spoke about walking 15 kilometers to bring his grandson for treatment. A young mother cradled her baby who had survived pneumonia thanks to antibiotics that cost less than $5. The morning passed peacefully. Sarah captured footage of medical procedures, interviewed aid workers, and documented the small miracles that occurred daily in this unlikely sanctuary. For a few hours, the war felt distant, pushed back by the simple act of healing. Suggested they break for lunch at his cousin's house, which sat halfway between the clinic and the main village. The modest home offered a commanding view of the surrounding terrain, including the narrow valley where coalition forces occasionally patrolled. Sarah agreed, grateful for the opportunity to review her footage and plan the afternoon's interviews. They were sharing flatbread and strong tea when cousin burst through the door. The man spoke rapidly in Pashto, his words tumbling over each other in obvious panic. His face went pale as he listened, then turned to Sarah with fear in his eyes. "Taliban fighters have surrounded the clinic," he translated. "They have hostages. The coalition forces are coming, but they are still 1 hour away. My cousin says we should leave immediately, go to the mountains until the fighting stops." Sarah's mind raced. Her professional instincts warred with common sense. The story developing at the clinic would be international news. If Taliban forces had taken hostages at a medical facility, it represented a significant escalation in tactics. Her footage could provide crucial evidence of war crimes, but staying meant risking capture or death. Through the window, she could see smoke rising from the direction of the clinic. The sound of gunfire echoed across the valley, distant but growing closer. Gathered their equipment with shaking hands, clearly expecting her to choose retreat. Instead, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She had covered conflicts from Somalia to Syria, always maintaining the journalist's sacred distance from the story. But as she watched smoke billow from a building where she had just filmed children receiving life-saving medical care, something shifted inside her. "We're not leaving," she told firmly. "Those people in the clinic trusted us to tell their story. We can't abandon them now." Stared at her as if she had lost her mind. Perhaps she had. But Sarah had spent 5 years documenting other people's courage. Today, she would discover her own. The next few hours would test everything she thought she knew about herself, about war, and about the thin line between observer and participant that every war correspondent must navigate. As they prepared to move toward the sound of gunfire, Sarah had no idea that her camera would soon be useless, and that her survival would depend on skills she never knew she possessed. The story of how a war reporter became a deadly marksman was about to begin, written in the dust and blood of an Afghan village where the rules of engagement meant nothing, and where 11 perfect shots would save lives that no one else could reach. The approach to the clinic's west entrance required moving through a series of irrigation ditches that zigzagged across the open ground like a broken maze. Sarah followed Sergeant and his 3 soldiers, her press credentials replaced by the weight of the Beretta pistol in her hands. Every few meters, they froze as gunfire erupted from the roof, the Taliban snipers engaging targets they couldn't see from their current position. Hand signaled for them to stop as they reached the final stretch before the building. 50 meters of open ground separated them from the service entrance Sarah had described. Through her camera's zoom lens, she could see the door was still ajar, exactly as the clinic staff had left it during their hasty evacuation. "Movement on the roof," whispered Corporal, the team's designated marksman. He peered through his rifle scope at the clinic's parapet. 2 tangos visible, possibly more. Sarah studied the building through her camera. The Taliban fighters on the roof were focused on the main road where the convoy approached and the drainage ditch where they expected coalition forces to remain pinned down. Their positioning suggested they didn't anticipate an assault from the west side. The sound of approaching vehicles grew louder, checked his watch and grimaced. "Convoy's 2 minutes out, maybe less. We go now or we don't go at all." They moved in a tactical formation Sarah had seen in countless news reports but never experienced firsthand. Took point, followed by and the other 2 soldiers, with Sarah bringing up the rear. The 50-meter sprint felt endless. Every step expected return fire from the roof, every breath might trigger a muzzle flash that would end everything. They reached the service entrance without being detected, tested the door, found it unlocked, and eased it open. The familiar smell of medical supplies and disinfectant greeted them, now mixed with the acrid scent of gunpowder and fear. Sarah's knowledge of the building layout proved crucial. She guided them through the supply room and into a narrow hallway that connected to the main treatment area. Through the walls, they could hear voices speaking in rapid Pashto, punctuated by occasional sobs and whimpers that could only come from terrified hostages. Positioned his men at the hallway entrance and studied the situation ahead. The treatment room was larger than a typical hospital ward, with 6 examination tables and medical equipment scattered throughout. Sarah counted at least 3 Taliban fighters visible through the doorway, their attention divided between watching the hostages and monitoring radio communications. The tactical problem was immediate and complex. Any frontal assault risked hitting hostages who were clustered together near the far wall. The fighters had positioned themselves to use the medical equipment as cover while maintaining clear fields of fire toward both entrances. "I need eyes on the staircase," whispered. "If we take this room and can't control access to the roof, those snipers will come down behind us." Sarah raised her camera and used its telephoto lens to study the room's layout. The concrete staircase was exactly where she remembered it, built into the far corner of the treatment room. Two Taliban fighters stood near its base, their rifles trained on the hostages, while a third man spoke urgently into a handheld radio. "Staircase is covered," she reported quietly. "3 fighters in the room, maybe more upstairs. Hostages are grouped together on the left side." The sound of vehicles reached them from outside. The Taliban convoy had arrived. Through the windows, Sarah could see armed men jumping from pickup trucks and taking positions around the clinic's perimeter. In minutes, the building would be surrounded by 20 or more fighters. Made a command decision. "You take the man by the radio, the fighter nearest the stairs. Davis, the one covering the hostages. I'll move to secure the staircase. You stay here and watch our backs." It was a textbook room-clearing operation, except textbooks assumed you weren't trying to rescue hostages while outnumbered 5-1 with enemy reinforcements arriving outside. Counted down from 3 on his fingers, then led the assault. The next 30 seconds redefined Sarah's understanding of combat. The careful coordination she had observed in military training exercises dissolved into chaos when real bullets started flying in confined spaces. His first shot dropped the radio operator, but the man managed to squeeze off a burst from his AK-47 before falling. Engaged his target, but missed due to a medical cart that blocked his sight line. The Taliban fighter dove for cover behind an examination table and returned fire. Sarah watched sprint toward the staircase while gunfire erupted around him. She saw him stumble as a bullet caught him in the shoulder, but he kept moving. The fighter guarding the stairs swung his rifle toward the sergeant, and Sarah realized wouldn't make it. 5 years of war reporting had taught her to observe and document, but sometimes documentation required action. Without conscious thought, Sarah raised the Beretta and fired 3 quick shots at the fighter, threatening. The first shot missed. The second caught the man in the chest. The third was unnecessary, but she pulled the trigger anyway. Reached the staircase and immediately took cover behind its concrete wall. "Stairs secure," he shouted over the gunfire. 2 more tangos coming down." The tactical situation had shifted. Coalition forces controlled the ground floor, but Taliban fighters were descending from the roof, while others surrounded the building from outside. The hostages remained clustered together, frozen by terror as bullets flew over their heads. Sarah found herself moving without orders. Her camera bounced against her chest as she ran toward the hostages, driven by instincts she didn't know she possessed. Doctor looked up at her with a mixture of relief and confusion. "Are you hit?" Sarah asked the doctor while scanning the group for injuries. "No, but Mrs. Ahmadi has been shot in the leg. She needs immediate medical attention." Sarah looked at the elderly woman who sat propped against the wall, her traditional dress stained with blood. The wound was serious but not immediately life-threatening. More pressing was the sound of gunfire from the staircase, where was holding off fighters trying to descend from the roof. "Can you move her?" Sarah asked Doctor. "With help, yes, but where? The building is surrounded." That was the question that would determine whether any of them survived the next 10 minutes. Sarah raised her camera and used its telephoto lens to study the windows facing different directions. Through the north-facing window, she could see Taliban fighters taking positions behind the vehicles they had arrived in. The east window showed more fighters moving to surround the building, but the south window revealed something unexpected. Was visible in the distance, waving frantically from behind a low wall about 300 meters away. Behind him, Sarah could see movement that looked like additional coalition forces. The relief column that had been promised was closer than anyone realized. She called to the soldier who was changing magazines behind an overturned medical cart. "South window, friendly forces approaching." Lowe crawled to the window and peered out through his rifle scope. "Confirmed. I count 6 vehicles, maybe a full platoon. ETA 5 minutes. 5 minutes might as well have been 5 hours. The Taliban fighters surrounding the building would storm the clinic long before help arrived. was still holding the staircase, but Sarah could see blood seeping through his uniform. He was running out of ammunition and strength. The radio the Taliban fighter had dropped was still crackling with transmissions in Pashto. Sarah grabbed it and thrust it toward Doctor. "Can you understand what they're saying?" The Spanish doctor had worked in Afghanistan for 2 years and spoke enough Pashto to communicate with patients. She listened for a moment, her face growing pale. "They're planning to execute all the hostages in 2 minutes, before the coalition forces arrive. They want to create a massacre that will be blamed on the rescue attempt." Sarah looked around the treatment room. 9 hostages cowered against the wall. 4 coalition soldiers fought desperately to hold positions they couldn't maintain much longer. Outside, 20 Taliban fighters prepared to storm the building. And somewhere in the distance, a relief column raced against time to prevent a massacre. Everything came down to the next 2 minutes. Sarah had documented wars in 6 countries, but she had never faced a moment when her own actions would determine who lived and who died. Her camera could record whatever happened next, but recording wouldn't save anyone. She made a decision that would haunt her dreams for years to come. Sometimes the most important stories could only be told by those willing to do whatever it took to ensure someone survived to tell them. The Beretta felt heavier in her hands as she prepared to discover exactly what whatever it took meant in the context of urban combat. The Taliban were coming. The clock was running out, and Sarah was about to learn that war correspondents sometimes became warriors because there was no other choice. The sound of coordinated movement outside the clinic told Sarah that time had run out. Through the windows, she could see Taliban fighters positioning themselves for a final assault. They moved with practiced efficiency, using hand signals and tactical spacing that spoke of military training. This wasn't a ragtag insurgent group, but a disciplined unit executing a planned operation. His voice echoed from the staircase, strained but determined. 2 more coming down, need covering fire. Sarah found herself making split-second decisions that would have been unthinkable an hour earlier. She directed Doctor and 2 other hostages toward a storage closet that offered better protection from incoming gunfire, then moved to Support, who was engaging targets through the north window. "They're massing for a coordinated breach," reported. "Front and back entrances simultaneously, classic pincer movement." Sarah raised her camera to document the approaching assault, but the lens revealed something that changed everything. Among the Taliban fighters gathering near the front entrance, she recognized a face that made her blood run cold. The man directing the assault was Commander Malik, a Taliban leader she had interviewed 6 months earlier for a story about insurgent tactics. During that interview, conducted in a mountain cave near the Pakistani border, had spoken extensively about his philosophy of warfare. He believed in making examples that would deter future coalition operations. Prisoners weren't taken. Witnesses weren't left alive. The clinic attack wasn't just tactical, it was symbolic. "That's Malik out there," Sarah said urgently. "He's the local Taliban commander. I interviewed him last year. He doesn't take prisoners." Paused his shooting to look at her. "You interviewed a Taliban commander." "That's my job. But right now, my job is making sure someone lives to tell this story." The weight of that responsibility settled on her shoulders like a physical burden. 9 innocent people were about to die because they had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. 4 soldiers were outnumbered 5 to 1, with no hope of reinforcement arriving in time. The coalition relief column was still 4 minutes away according to radio contact. 4 minutes was an eternity in urban combat. The first explosion came from the front entrance. Taliban fighters had used a small explosive charge to blow the main door off its hinges. Gunfire immediately erupted as they poured into the building's reception area. At the same time, more fighters appeared at the service entrance where Sarah's group had originally entered. "They're in the building," shouted from his position near the hallway. "Multiple tangos front and rear." Sarah found herself caught between her training as a journalist and her instincts as a human being. Every professional guideline told her to observe and document. But observation wouldn't save the lives of people who had trusted her enough to grant interviews just hours earlier. She made a choice that redefined everything she thought she knew about herself. Moving to the west window, Sarah used her camera's telephoto lens to assess the exterior situation. 2 Taliban fighters had remained outside to prevent escape attempts. They stood behind a pickup truck, Their attention focused on the building's entrances where the main assault was taking place. Appeared beside her, his left arm hanging useless from the shoulder wound. "What do you see?" "Two guards outside, west side. They're not watching this window." Nodded grimly. "We need to get the hostages out before men reach this room. The relief column won't arrive in time to save them." Sarah looked at the terrified faces huddled in the storage closet. Doctor was using medical supplies to treat Mrs. Ahmadi's gunshot wound, while 3 nurses tried to comfort 2 elderly patients who were shaking with fear. Their survival depended on decisions made by people who had never planned to become combatants. "The irrigation ditch runs within 20 meters of this window," Sarah said, studying the terrain through her camera. "If we can eliminate those 2 guards, there's a covered route back toward the village." Checked his ammunition. "I've got maybe 10 rounds left, not enough for a sustained firefight." Sarah looked at the Beretta in her hands. She had fired 3 shots and hit 1 target. Basic mathematics suggested she had enough ammunition for 1 more engagement, but mathematics didn't account for stress, adrenaline, or the fact that she was operating far outside her professional comfort zone. "I can make the shots," she said with more confidence than she felt. Studied her face. Combat leadership required instant assessments of capability and reliability. His next decision would determine whether the hostage evacuation succeeded or failed catastrophically. "You're sure?" Sarah thought about the weekends in Montana, learning to shoot deer at distances far greater than 20 meters. She thought about the interviews she had conducted with military snipers, their descriptions of breathing techniques and trigger control. Most importantly, she thought about Doctor, who had spent 2 years saving lives in a war zone and deserved the chance to continue that work. "I'm sure." Positioned himself to provide covering fire while Sarah prepared for shots that would either save lives or doom everyone in the room. Through her camera's telephoto lens, she studied the 2 Taliban guards. They stood approximately 15 meters apart, using the pickup truck as cover while monitoring the building's perimeter. The tactical problem was immediately apparent. Eliminating 1 guard would alert the other, creating a small window of time to engage the second target before he could raise an alarm or return fire. Missing either shot would compromise the entire evacuation attempt. Sarah had covered enough conflicts to understand the mechanics of combat shooting, but understanding and executing were entirely different skills. Her hands trembled slightly as she raised the Beretta, muscle memory from Montana hunting trips, competing with adrenaline from the most intense situation of her life. The first shot took the nearer guard completely by surprise. He dropped without firing a round. The second guard turned toward the sound of gunfire, raising his rifle as he searched for the source of the threat. Sarah's second shot caught him center mass before he could locate her position. "Target's down," she reported to, amazed by the steadiness of her own voice. Immediately began organizing the evacuation. "Davis, covering positions at the windows. We move the hostages in 2 groups. Doctor goes first with the wounded woman and the 2 elderly patients." The evacuation proceeded with disciplined efficiency that would have impressed Sarah under normal circumstances. Now, she was too focused on survival to appreciate tactical excellence. The sound of gunfire from the building's interior was getting closer as Taliban fighters cleared room by room. Doctor squeezed Sarah's hand as she prepared to climb through the window. "Thank you for not just watching this time." The comment stung because it was accurate. Sarah had spent 5 years watching other people's tragedies unfold, maintaining professional distance while documenting human suffering. Today, professional distance had become a luxury she couldn't afford. The second group of hostages was preparing to evacuate when Commander's voice echoed through the building, speaking in accented English clearly intended for coalition ears. "You have 1 minute to surrender, or we execute everyone we find. No prisoners, no survivors." Checked his watch. The relief column was still 3 minutes away. 3 minutes might as well have been 3 hours when facing an enemy commander who specialized in making examples. Sarah found herself studying the building's layout one final time, looking for tactical options that didn't exist. The hostages were evacuating, but his men were trapped. Leaving meant abandoning 4 soldiers to certain death. Staying meant joining them. She made another choice that surprised her. Sometimes war correspondents became warriors because there was no other choice. Sometimes they became warriors because it was the right thing to do, regardless of the choice available. She said quietly, "I'm not leaving." The sergeant looked at her with something that might have been respect. "Ma'am, you've done enough. Get out while you can." Sarah chambered a fresh round in the Beretta and moved to a firing position. "Those people trusted me to tell their story. I can't do that if everyone dies." The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the hallway. Commander's fighters were close enough to hear individual voices. In 30 seconds, the treatment room would become a killing ground. Sarah had covered wars in 6 countries, but she had never faced a moment when her own actions would determine the difference between massacre and survival. Her camera hung around her neck, but her hands gripped a weapon. The story she was living would be told by whoever survived the next few minutes. The Taliban were coming. Time had run out, and Sarah was about to discover exactly what it meant to make perfect shots when everything depended on them. The sound of boots on concrete echoed through the hallway as Taliban fighters approached the treatment room. Sarah positioned herself behind an overturned examination table, the Beretta steady in her hands, despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. And his 3 soldiers had taken defensive positions that created overlapping fields of fire, but everyone knew the mathematics of their situation. 12 rounds of ammunition between 4 soldiers. An unknown number of Taliban fighters approaching from 2 directions. A wounded commander who could barely hold his rifle. And a war correspondent who had fired exactly 5 shots in combat with questionable results on 3 of them. "Movement in the hallway," whispered from his position near the main entrance. "At least 4 tangos, possibly more." Through her camera's telephoto lens, Sarah could see shapes moving beyond the doorway. The Taliban fighters were using tactical formation, advancing methodically rather than rushing into what they correctly assessed as a defensive position. These weren't untrained insurgents, but experienced fighters who understood urban combat. His voice was steady despite his obvious pain. "On my mark, we engage simultaneously. Make every shot count because we won't get a second chance." Sarah found herself thinking about the interviews she had conducted with combat veterans over the past 5 years. They had described moments like this, when time seemed to slow down and every detail became unnaturally clear. The smell of gunpowder and medical disinfectant, the sound of her own heartbeat, the weight of the pistol in her hands. The first Taliban fighter appeared in the doorway, his AK-47 sweeping the room for targets. Shot dropped him before he could fire. The second fighter immediately dove for cover behind a medical cart, but's rifle found him before he could establish a position. Then everything went wrong. 2 fighters appeared simultaneously at the service entrance, Catching and Davis in a crossfire. Davis went down with a chest wound that painted the white clinic wall red. Spun to engage the new threat, but took a round through the shoulder that sent his rifle clattering across the floor. Sarah watched turn to help his wounded comrades, exposing his position to the main hallway where more Taliban fighters were advancing. The tactical situation collapsed in seconds, transforming from a defensive stand to a desperate last fight. That was when Commander himself appeared. Sarah recognized him immediately. The same lean face she had interviewed in a mountain cave, the same cold eyes that had described his philosophy of warfare without emotion. But now those eyes were focused on her with something that might have been surprise. "The American journalist," said in accented English. "Still observing, I see, still documenting our little war." Sarah kept the Beretta trained on him while and tried to cover the wounded soldiers. "Not observing this time." Smiled, but it was the expression of a predator studying prey. "You think your small pistol makes you a soldier. You think killing 2 of my guards makes you dangerous. I think it makes me someone you should have killed first." The conversation bought precious seconds to reload and to establish a better firing position. But Sarah could see more fighters moving through the hallway behind. The mathematics hadn't improved. Then she heard something that changed everything. The distinctive sound of helicopter rotors approaching fast and low. Heard it too. His expression shifted from confident predator to concerned tactician as he calculated the implications of close air support arriving ahead of schedule. The relief column might still be minutes away, but attack helicopters could engage targets immediately. "You hear that?" Sarah called out. "Your grand gesture just became a tactical disaster. You're about to be trapped in a building with no escape routes and coalition forces controlling the airspace. His response was to raise his rifle toward the wounded Davis, who lay helpless against the far wall. Then we finish this quickly, starting with your wounded. Sarah made the most important shot of her life without conscious thought. The Beretta bucked in her hands, and Commander staggered backward with a look of genuine surprise before collapsing. The shot had been instinctive, fired the moment his rifle began to swing toward Davis. The psychological effect on the remaining Taliban fighters was immediate and profound. Their commander was down, coalition helicopters were approaching, and the tactical situation had shifted decisively against them. Sarah watched as they began withdrawing through the service entrance, carrying his body and abandoning their assault. Struggled to his feet, blood seeping through his uniform. Check the hallway, make sure they're gone. Sarah moved carefully toward the main entrance, the Beretta ready but her hands surprisingly steady. The hallway was empty except for the two fighters and had eliminated. Through the windows, she could see Taliban vehicles racing away from the clinic as attack helicopters appeared on the horizon. The relief column arrived 6 minutes later to find 4 wounded soldiers, one very shaken war correspondent, and a building full of evidence that would dominate international headlines for weeks. Sarah's camera had captured portions of the firefight, but the most important parts of the story existed only in her memory and the testimony of the people she had helped save. Doctor returned to the clinic 3 hours later to find Sarah sitting on the front steps, her camera finally in her hands, but her eyes focused on something far beyond the viewfinder. "The wounded soldiers will recover," the doctor reported. "Davis needs surgery, but he'll be fine, is already arguing with the medics about returning to duty." Sarah nodded but didn't lower her camera. "What about the hostages?" "Safe, all of them. Mrs. Ahmadi is being treated at the coalition base, but her wound was superficial. Everyone else is unharmed." For the first time since the firefight ended, Sarah allowed herself to fully process what had happened. She had fired 11 shots during the course of the day, 3 at the fighter threatening, 2 at the guards during the evacuation, 1 at commander, 5 more during the final firefight as Taliban reinforcements tried to flank their position. 11 shots, 11 hits, no misses. The mathematical precision seemed impossible, but combat sometimes created its own reality. Stress and adrenaline could destroy accuracy or enhance it, depending on training and temperament. Sarah had discovered she possessed skills she never knew existed, activated by circumstances she never could have imagined. Found her there as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the clinic walls orange and red. He sat beside her on the concrete steps, neither of them speaking for several minutes. "You saved many lives today," he said finally. Sarah looked at her camera, then at the bloodstains on the clinic entrance. "I was supposed to document lives, not save them. That was never supposed to be my job." "Sometimes the job changes," replied. "Sometimes circumstances choose us instead of us choosing circumstances." 3 months later, Sarah's story about the clinic siege would win international journalism awards and spark congressional hearings about military tactics in civilian areas. But those accolades felt hollow compared to the letter she received from Doctor, who had returned to Spain and was training to work in refugee camps. The letter included a photograph of Mrs. Ahmadi standing in her garden, fully recovered from her gunshot wound and holding her grandchild. On the back, someone had written in careful English, "Thank you for not just watching." Sarah kept that photograph on her desk for the rest of her career. Whenever editors asked her to cover conflicts in distant countries, she would look at Mrs. Ahmadi's face and remember the day she learned that war correspondents sometimes became warriors not because they chose to, but because choosing otherwise was unthinkable. The story of how 11 perfect shots saved lives during a Taliban ambush became legend among combat journalists and military personnel. But Sarah knew the real story was simpler and more complex than any headline could capture. Sometimes the most important stories could only be told by those willing to become part of them. Sometimes professional distance was a luxury that human decency couldn't afford. And sometimes a war correspondent discovered that bearing witness meant more than just holding a camera. 5 years later, Sarah would leave journalism to work for a medical relief organization, trading her press credentials for the opportunity to save lives more directly. But she never forgot the lesson learned in an Afghan clinic. that watching and acting weren't always separate choices, and that the best stories were often told by those who refused to let them end in tragedy. The camera could capture what happened. Only the human heart could determine what should happen. And on one bloody afternoon in a village clinic, Sarah discovered that her heart was capable of making perfect shots when everything depended on them.